And thanks to you at home for joining us here at this hour on this fine Friday night. I will tell you there are a bunch of moving parts in the news right now. And we're just going to take it one piece at a time, one step at a time, with the full and full-hearted expectation that more news will break over the course of this hour. You know it will, right? I mean, that has generally been our experience on Friday nights over the course of the Trump administration. But today and tonight already, it has just been relentless. So let's just jump in. We've got a whole show prepared. I'm sure it's all about to go out the window. Obviously, today was the second public hearing of the impeachment proceedings against President Trump. We're going to talk about that in detail tonight. In terms of the latest news, though, I do need to mention that as soon as the public hearing wrapped up today with U.S. Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, immediately thereafter, the impeachment committee started taking a closed-door deposition from another new witness. The public hearings, like the ones we saw with Ambassador Yovanovitch today, those are supposed to be the sort of second phase of the impeachment proceedings. But apparently, as more of this story is becoming known to the public and to the investigators, and as more witnesses are coming forward, you know, the impeachment committees are having to sort of figure out what to do with new folks who are relevant to the investigation that they're still proceeding with. So they're discovering new witnesses. They're then arranging testimony from these new witnesses. And in order to do that, they're basically going back behind closed doors to take initial closed door depositions from these new witnesses before deciding whether they, too, will go on to be part of any public proceedings. So Yovanovitch wrapped today at this public hearing. But then immediately after that, the impeachment committees, not just the Intelligence Committee, but also Foreign Affairs and Oversight, they went back behind closed doors at the secure conference room at the Capitol to take a closed-door deposition from David Holmes. Now, David Holmes is a career Foreign Service officer. We heard about him for the first time, though not by name, at the first public impeachment hearing that happened this week, when Ambassador Bill Taylor broke this surprise news.
Last Friday, a member of my staff told me of events that occurred on July 26th. In the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for. At the time I gave my deposition on October 22nd, I was not aware of this information. I'm including it here for completeness.
So we learn of that story just a couple of days ago in Ambassador Bill Taylor's testimony at the first impeachment hearing, right? It's kind of a dramatic reveal. A member of his staff coming forward to tell him of something that the ambassador didn't know about before, which is that there had been a phone call between President Trump personally and Ambassador Gordon Sondland, who called the president from a restaurant in Ukraine on his cell phone on July 26th, the day after President Trump had that call with the Ukrainian president. That's the call that has basically led to these impeachment proceedings. In that call on July 26th, Taylor's staff member says he was able to hear the president on that phone inquiring personally about those investigations that he was pressing Ukraine for. Well, there's been a quick turnaround in terms of running that story to ground. And so now today, that staffer that was referenced in Bill Taylor's testimony 2 days ago, that staffer has now been brought to Capitol Hill, and today he gave his closed-door deposition. And credit to CNN's excellent congressional correspondent, Manu Raju, who was first to obtain a copy of the opening statement that David Holmes gave in that closed-door deposition today. You can see it here. It's obviously a photocopy of a folded sheet that contained his opening statement. Manu Raju obtained this, CNN posted it, and it's a doozy. I will warn you, there's a couple of swears here eventually. I'm not going to say the swear words, but if you're disturbed by knowing where they are, you should know they're coming. First, let me read you what David Holmes says is basically his explanation as to why he's coming forward at this late point in the process. He says, quote, as the current impeachment inquiry has progressed, I have followed press reports and reviewed the statements of Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Yovanovitch. Based on my experience in Ukraine, my recollection is generally consistent with their testimony, and I believe that the relevant facts were therefore being laid out for the American people. However, in the last week or so, I read press reports expressing for the first time that certain senior officials may have been acting without the president's knowledge in their dealing, and suggesting that the only evidence being elicited at the hearings was hearsay. I came to realize, Holmes says, that I had firsthand knowledge regarding certain events on July 26th that had otherwise not been reported, and that those events potentially bore on the question of whether the president, in fact, had knowledge that those officials were using the levers of our diplomatic power to induce the new Ukrainian president to announce the opening of a particular criminal investigation. It is at that point that I made the observation to Ambassador Taylor that the incident I had witnessed had acquired greater significance, which is what he reported in his testimony earlier this week. So that's why Holmes is saying, this is why I'm coming forward. I realized that, what I know, I thought it was just consistent with what you've already heard. But then I realized I actually know something that other people don't, and that other people are saying, isn't the way this all went down. You need to know about this thing that I know. Now, as to this July 26th call, the way Bill Taylor described it in his testimony 2 days ago, I think actually sort of underplays it compared to what David Holmes has just described to the impeachment committees today, at least as far as his opening statement. But we've got that now. And again, what he's describing here in time, this is late July. July 25th, President Trump makes that call to the Ukrainian president, right? We've all seen the call notes from that. It led ultimately to this impeachment inquiry. The day after that, a delegation of U.S. officials, including Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the Trump donor guy who was assigned to be ambassador to the EU, and then the president inexplicably reassigned him to go work on Ukraine instead. Ambassador Gordon Sondland and this witness who testified today, David Holmes, they went into a high-level meeting with the Ukrainian government, including a meeting with President Zelensky, just one day after President Zelensky had that call with President Trump. And at that point, David Holmes said he hadn't himself had a readout as to what had happened during the call the previous day between Trump and Zelensky. But he says Zelensky, the following day at his meeting, said that, quote, President Trump had 3 times raised some very sensitive issues and that he would have to follow up on those issues when they met in person. Holmes says, quote, not having received a readout of the July 25th call, I did not know what those sensitive issues were. Holmes says, quote, as I was leaving the meeting with President Zelensky, I was told to join another meeting with Ambassador Sondland. When that meeting ended, the 2 staffers and I accompanied Ambassador Sondland out of the presidential administration building and into the embassy vehicle. Ambassador Sondland said he wanted to go to lunch. I told Ambassador Sondland I'd be happy to join if he wanted to brief me on his meetings or discuss other issues. Ambassador Sondland said that I should join. The 2 staffers joined for lunch as well. The 4 of us went to a nearby restaurant and sat on an outdoor terrace. I sat directly across from Ambassador Sondland, and the 2 staffers sat off to our sides. At first, the lunch was largely social. Ambassador Sondland selected a bottle of wine that he shared among the 4 of us, and we discussed topics such as marketing strategies for his hotel business. Right? At which point I interject with narrator voice, your taxpayer dollars at work, right? This ambassador talking about marketing strategies for his hotel business with all of these foreign service officers and embassy staffers. But then here's the part that Bill Taylor brought to the attention of the impeachment committees. Quote, during the lunch, Ambassador Sondland said that he was going to call President Trump to give him an update. Ambassador Sondland placed the call on his mobile phone, and I heard him announce himself several times along the lines of Gordon Sondland, holding for the president. It appeared that he was being transferred through several layers of switchboards and assistants. I then noticed Ambassador Sondland's demeanor change, and I understood that he had been connected to President Trump. While Ambassador Sondland's phone was not on speakerphone, I could hear the president's voice through the earpiece of the phone. The president's voice was very loud and recognizable. And Ambassador Sondland held the phone away from his ear for a period of time, presumably because of the loud volume. I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain that he was calling from Kiev. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied, yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, forgive me here, he went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass. I said I wasn't going to say the swear word, and then I just did. I'm sorry. Holmes continues, I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation? Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky, quote, will do anything you ask him to. Even though I did not take notes on these statements, I have a clear recollection that these statements were made. I believe that my colleagues who were sitting at the table also knew that Ambassador Sondland was speaking with the president, which would mean there are two more witnesses who can attest to the fact that this happened. David Holmes then describes some of the other things that happened on that conversation he could overhear between Gordon Sondland and President Trump, including, naturally, a reference to the Kardashians. Long story. We'll talk about that some other time. But then there's this. He says, quote, after the call ended, Ambassador Sondland remarked that the president was in a bad mood, as Ambassador Sondland stated is often the case early in the morning. I then took the opportunity to ask Ambassador Sondland for his candid impression of the president's views on Ukraine. In particular, I asked Ambassador Sondland if it was true that the president did not give a shoot about Ukraine. He didn't say shoot. Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give a shoot about Ukraine. I asked, why not? And Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about, quote, big stuff. I noted that there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia. Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing. The conversation then moved on to other topics. Again, that's from the opening statement from Foreign Service Officer David Holmes, which was obtained and first published tonight by CNN. That witness both corroborating the testimony we've heard thus far from witnesses like Ambassadors Bill Taylor and Marie Yovanovitch, but also directly quoting the president in a conversation in which the president appears to have been checking up on his man in Ukraine to inquire as to the progress of these investigations into the Bidens that he was leaning on that foreign government to provide him. The president pressuring that foreign government to do those investigations, of course, because of the domestic political benefit he thought they would provide him here at home. And that, of course, is the core issue for which the president is now being impeached. David Holmes' testimony and presumably any further corroborating testimony on this matter that we may get from those other two alleged witnesses who were sitting there listening to that call as well, or maybe even from Ambassador Gordon Sondland himself, who is scheduled to testify next week. That testimony, I mean, it all puts the president squarely and personally in the role of not only running this operation for which he's being impeached, but personally checking in on its progress as the pressure campaign was at its apex. So, I mean, that's all happened. That's all come out tonight since the Yovanovitch testimony at this dramatic hours-long hearing today.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.